Everyone, good afternoon or morning, wherever you are. Glad you're able to join us for our second set of virtual field trips as part of the AFE conference this week. We had field trips yesterday that took us to the Appalachians or whatever you want to call it, and then also down to the Jones Center in South Georgia. So today we have two field trips that will take us, depending where you are, to the far north or maybe south or in other directions. We have folks who will be taking us to the Rocky Mountains in the northern US for the second half. And right up here in just a moment, we'll be joining some colleagues from Parks Canada, and they'll be taking us to share a story of fire in Banff National Park. So first up, we have Jane Park and Tommy Hooper-Wolf with Parks Canada. They're going to share their field tour, and then we should have time afterwards for questions and open conversation if you'd like. We're here in Zoom. We don't have a big crowd, so we hope that afterwards we'll have the opportunity to really engage in some good conversation with our field trip hosts and share some information, share some knowledge, and build some connections from across the world. So without any further ado, Tommy and Jane, are you all ready?
Yep.
All right, we'll take it away.
Hi and welcome everyone. My name is Tommy Hooper. I'm a fire technician in Banff National Park. And with me I have Jane Park, who is the fire and vegetation specialist here in Banff as well. I'd first like to start with a land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that Banff National Park is within the present day territories of the Treaty 6, 7, and 8, as well as the Métis homeland. The lands and waters of Banff have been used for millennia by Indigenous peoples for sustenance, ceremony, trade, and travel. We thank them for their continuous stewardship and for sharing the land with us. So to start, just giving a brief overview, we'll go over briefly the Banff National Park fire regime, overview of the fire management program. We'll go through our virtual field trip through the Sawback, Flintstony, and the Fairholme prescribed fires. We'll give a brief overview of our communications and stakeholder engagement, along with Indigenous cultural burning practices, a quick conclusion followed by our question and answers that we hope to have. So Banff National Park was the first national park in Canada, and it was established in 1885. It was the second national park created in North America after Yellowstone and third in the world. It is also a UNESCO World Heritage Site in combination with 3 other national parks and 3 provincial parks. The area of Banff National Park is 1.64 million acres, which converts to 0.66 million hectares, which is quite a large area. As you can see, we've got Jasper to the north, arrow pointing to Banff, Yoho, and Kootenay National Parks, all adjacent to Banff National Park.
So I'll just briefly go over what the historic fire regime is in the areas that we'll be kind of taking you guys on a tour of. And the first, we've got obviously a lot of elevational differences in the Rocky Mountains here in Canada. In our area, we're on the eastern slopes in Alberta, and at the lower elevations in the Montane, it's kind of a spring and summer fire regime, largely fueled, like many fires in North America, by Indigenous cultural burning. A lot of our fire history studies have shown in periods where there are no lightning occurrences, typically in the spring and the fall, that there were many frequent low intensity and low severity fires in these valley bottoms. And through other traditional knowledge studies and interviews, they've determined that a lot of this cultural burning was done for ceremony, but also to maintain travel routes and habitat for prey species and medicinal plants. As you move up the mountains, we get into more of a subalpine ecoregion. Those forests are typified by summer lightning caused fires that are mixed to high severity. So a lot of stand replacing fires. Those fires in those higher elevations are relatively infrequent, anywhere from 100 to several hundred-year fire cycles. Next point. But obviously, similar to a lot of places all over the world, Banff National Park was also subject to fire exclusion. The fire exclusion was based primarily on kind of the development of the area, but also in the extirpation of the indigenous people from the area in the park. And with the relocation of most of the nations that shared this land here prior to the park, they were moved outside of the park. And with that, their cultural burning practices also moved. Because of those fire exclusionary policies, the forests have become dense and overgrown. There's been a decrease in biodiversity, both in the vegetation and the wildlife. Many of them are degraded ecosystems in terms of high instances of forest insects and disease and increased risk for severe wildfires. Next slide. So this graph just kind of shows you, what the fire area burned was like just at the kind of turn of the century when the park was first established. You can still see a number of fires occurring, anywhere from the beginning of the 1900s into the 40s. Most of these were railway fires as the railway went through the park, and then a few wildfires. Then you barely see any fires through the 40s through the 60s until about 1968 and 1974, where you see some wildfires. And some of those wildfires really triggered a lot of research within Parks Canada to look at fire ecology and succession post-fire and impacts of the fire on the ecosystem, and an acknowledgement that fire was a restorative process on the landscape that needed to be restored. So in 1983, the first prescribed fire in Banff National Park was conducted, just a small 6 hectares. And the program has grown significantly since then, with people like my predecessor, Ian Pengelly, implementing large landscape level stand replacing fires. And then since then, we've been able to take advantage of a lot of that and do some iterative prescribed fires on the same locations to convert some of the vegetation back to the historic range of variability and what you would typically see in the montane, which were a lot of more open Douglas fir and aspen grasslands. Next slide. And so this next slide, we're just going to show you just a really quick video. It just references, how Banff National Park and Parks Canada is using prescribed fire in terms of resilience to climate change. And so I thought a video might be nicer than us chatting about PowerPoint.
Climate change is here. We can see it, we can smell it. Large catastrophic wildfires have caused significant impacts on communities across North America. Climate modeling predicts fire seasons will become longer, there will be more drought, and fires will be more severe and larger in the coming years. For over a century, our approach was to suppress all wildfires, resulting in forests that are dense and overgrown, like matchsticks, ready to ignite. Because of this, Banff National Park and its communities are not immune to the threats of climate change and natural wildfires. One way Parks Canada is creating more climate change resilient landscapes is through prescribed fire. Banff National Park was the first Canadian national park to implement prescribed fire in 1983, long before the impacts of climate change were understood. We continue to use prescribed fire, managed wildfires, and fuel management to create ecosystems that can better withstand the impacts of climate change on future wildfires. By creating diverse forests and open grassland habitats, with tree species like Douglas fir and aspen, we can create landscapes that are more resilient to insects, disease, drought, wildfire, and climate change. By furthering our understanding of fire in our ecosystems, we can continue to adapt to our changing climate, ultimately protecting Banff National Park, its communities, and the wildlife and vegetation who call this place home.
So this next slide shows a map of the prescribed burns in the areas that we're going to be visiting on our field trip. So you can see where Banff is in the middle there. We're going to travel a bit west over to the Sawback prescribed burn, which has had many iterations over the last 20 years or so. The last time we burned it was in 2014, and then we're going to fly up north up to the Flint Stony Meadows prescribed burn that we completed over the last 2 years. And then we'll fly down south down the Cascade Valley past Lake Minnewanka down to the Fairhill.
The Sawback Range is located 5 kilometers upwind of the town of Banff and historically is composed of aspen and Doug-fir grasslands, which are similar to elsewhere in the national park. There have been many iterations of prescribed fires over the years, and they not all necessarily overlapped. There have been 10 prescribed fires between 1984 and 1998, with a total of 1,870 hectares, with the most recent burn being in 2014. By 2014, a large amount of coarse-woody debris, pine and spruce regen accumulated, making it difficult for wildlife to travel. Significant mortality of wolves and bears on the Highway 1A and the Canadian Pacific Railway resulted. The prescribed burn took place on a Friday of the Canadian Thanksgiving long weekend, which limited road closures as the Trans-Canada Highway stayed open the whole time. As a result, many tourists stopped to talk to the information officer with over 200 contacts. There were no negative comments once ecological objectives were explained. The prescribed burn was very visible from the Trans-Canada Highway, as it is also adjacent to the Highway 1A across the river. The burn was conducted with favorable wind direction to mitigate smoke and air quality effects in the town of Banff, despite it being 5 kilometers downwind. Some locals did not know that 700 hectares were burned that day. During the burn, air quality was measured at the Banff Warden Station. We also took advantage of good venting conditions through atmospheric instability, wind direction, and a lack of inversions. The incoming precipitation also reduced the periods of smoke. Another aspect of our smoke management plan is to inform our smoke-sensitive stakeholders through social media, newspapers, emails, and signage, with the use of our other communication staff as well. The prescribed fire was lit through aerial ignition as well as hand ignition using drip torches from some of the Parks Canada crews. The general goals outlined by the Banff Park Management Plan of 2010 and the Bow Valley Parkway Action Plan of 2012 are to improve wildlife habitat and vegetation species diversity within the Sawback Range and to maintain forest cover, structure, and function within the range of natural ability. The ecological objectives are to improve habitat quality for the establishment of whitebark pine, as well as to improve the quantity and the quality of grizzly bear habitat by reducing lodgepole pine regeneration, as well as reducing downwoody debris. Another ecological objective is to restore Douglas fir and aspen grasslands. It ended up snowing 2 days after the burn was complete, which minimized holdovers and mop-up requirements. Now, after many iterations of prescribed fire, we have successfully returned a large portion of this area to its historic fire regime, being frequent fire in Douglas fir grasslands for a 10 to 50-year fire cycle. see the West Sulphur Wildfire Risk Reduction Project, which is adjacent to the town of Banff, and how close that is to the Sawback prescribed burn of 2014. In this clip, you can see how close the Trans-Canada Highway, Highway 1A, and the Canadian Pacific Railway are to the burn unit, and why this prescribed burn was so important for wildlife, forest health due to mountain pine beetle, and protecting the town of Banff. Wetbark pine was planted after the fire, as wetbark pine is a species at risk and is considered endangered. Within the unit as well, there are other wolf dens and bear dens. As you can see, there is less coarse-wooded debris opening up travel corridors for wildlife, with an increase in diversity of vegetation as well. The unit is split up into 4 distinct places, as you can see on the map here. The first burns in the Flints Meadows took place in the fall of 1998, with 130 hectares burned, with subsequent burns in 1999 of 25 hectares, in 2000 where multiple meadows were burned with a total of 153 hectares. There were also more meadows burned in 2001 for a total of 488 hectares, and finally 35 hectares were burned in 2007, which is a similar burn to the one we did in the fall of 2021 that we'll see later here. The Fire and Vegetation Department all took turns coming out to help in the collection of fire effects monitoring, looking at some of the grassy slopes and also some of the areas where we have really thick regen. Fire effects monitoring protocols were developed to assess stand structure, composition, fine and coarse-wooded debris loading, grass clip plots, vegetation identification, canopy cover, and depth. Similar ecological objectives to the Sawback and the Fairholme prescribed burns are trying to limit conifer regen maturing before coning and coarse-wooded debris buildup, which limits wildlife's abilities to travel through the area. Additionally, objectives to maintain a higher grassland habitat for bighorn sheep and open up over-mature lodgepole pine for other montane species, such as elk, bears, and the newly reintroduced bison into Banff National Park. When we came back in the spring of 2021, there were already bighorn sheep and elk grazing on what was burned in the fall of 2020, because it had greened up early due to the albedo and the black ground along with the solar radiation. Additionally, as you can see, elk and bighorn sheep moved into the area shortly after our fall 2021 meadow burn, which is exciting to see how wildlife moved back into an area after it's been burned. In the fall, bison are often attracted to areas that have burned in the spring due to the native fescue grasses that grow during the summer. Unfortunately, our bison have stayed further north thus far. The female elk are marked in yellow and the male elk are marked in blue. As you can see, they've already started to move in through the Flint Stony area, along with bighorn sheep, who have also started to move in through this area, as you can see here. With the newly acquired drones, we attempted to use them to identify hotspots for mop-up concerns, which is a fun and very useful technology that we'll be utilizing more of in the future. Seen here, the coarse-woody debris has developed significantly in areas where there has been no fire since 2007, making it difficult for wildlife to move through the area. There's also been conifer encroachment and dead grass accumulation, resulting in increased fuel loads within the meadows. This prescribed fire helped control the amount of conifer encroachment while also encouraging the regrowth of grasses and shrub species in these areas. We burned in the spring to take advantage of the higher duff moisture to promote native fescue grasslands. Burning in the spring during the spring dip aids in maintaining a low to moderate intensity surface fire. The spring dip is when the ground is still frozen, yet the vegetation is starting to use up the residual moisture stored within the plant, creating drought-like conditions. The frozen ground also aids in the protection of the soil horizons. This area shows that once a stand replacing prescribed fire has been completed, it's easy to get short one-day windows to do a fair bit of burning with minimal personnel. This part of the fire was completed in the fall of 2020. combination of aerial ignition with an aerial ignition device dropping fireballs of potassium permanganate that are injected with glycol for the areas of larger amounts of coarse woody debris and on the steeper slopes. We use drip torches for the valley bottom meadows. Burning of shrub meadows within the Flints meadows was completed to increase wildlife forage habitat, which is what we're doing here using strip ignition. Similarly, in the fall, after some fall moisture and curing, in our case, there was a few centimeters of snow on this meadow 2 weeks prior to its burning. We were burning these meadows in the fall in an attempt to limit the amount of shrub regen in the spring and summer of 2022. The Flint's meadow burning being completed here amounted to about 36 hectares in total. This is the third meadow as part of our prescribed burn for that day. As you can see, it went quite well and amounted to about 32 hectares. At the end of October and start of November in the fall of 2021, the vegetation section of our department went out to the Stony Meadows burn units to plant whitebark pine in key areas that were selected as core habitat for survival due to the preferred slope aspect and lack of competition from lodgepole pine, spruce, and subalpine fir. As you can see here, one of our vegetation technicians is taking care to open up the roots of these whitebark pine seedlings. Is classified as an environmental sensitive site as it is the largest continuous area of montane ecoregion in Banff. This montane ecoregion is important for wildlife habitat and diversity, yet only comprises 2% of the area within Banff. The historic town of Bankhead is an old mining town which has coal seams throughout the Fairholme Bench, along with other archaeological artifacts that require protecting. Montane is super important for wildlife habitat and diversity, yet it only comprises 2% of the area within Banff. The wildlife found in the montane are grizzly bears, wolves, elk, and deer, with the historic vegetation of Douglas fir grasslands and aspen lands, as you can see here, which is overgrown with lodgepole pine. The prescribed burn is located in between the town of Banff to the west and the town of Canmore to the south. In the early 2000s, mountain pine beetle populations in British Columbia started to significantly increase. In Banff, mountain pine beetle is a native insect and a natural disturbance like wildfire. Banff has had mountain pine beetle increases almost every decade, but in the 2000s, there was so much over-mature lodgepole pine, which contributed to significant tree mortality, increasing the danger of high-severity fire within the Bow Valley. One major objective of the Fairholme was to reduce mountain pine beetle susceptible forests at the landscape scale adjacent to provincial working forests, along with increasing forest heterogeneity and resilience to mountain pine beetle and wildfire. We used a stand replacement fire to convert vegetation, converting dense conifer to an open montane forest. The Fairholme prescribed burn was also a major step in wildfire risk reduction for the town of Canmore and the hamlet of Harvey Heights, located to the east of the unit. The Carrot Creek fuel break, located at the east end of the unit along the national park boundary, was 300 hectares of mechanical thinning. We are starting to utilize drone technology to conduct reconnaissance in areas we want to have burned, to aid in the development of strategies and tactics, along with the ability to document these areas in a more financially responsible way. 2003 was a major fire year in Western Canada, with the Kamloops barrier fires and fires in Kootenay National Park. Parks Canada ignited the fair home in the spring of 2003, but it held over due to severe drought conditions in July and August, with over 40 days without rain and the ever-reliable June monsoon not happening. Many areas in the unit ended up reburning more severely in August. This prescribed burn was a huge feat to complete given its location adjacent to the Trans-Canada Highway, which is the main transportation corridor in Canada running east to west. There are huge impacts to the economy if the Trans-Canada Highway closes even for an hour. A prime example of this is the current flooding that's happening in British Columbia. That is causing huge supply chain issues to get goods and services to and from the affected areas. This PB also had an extensive and detailed communications plan to ensure stakeholders were informed and highway smoke mitigation plans were in place. Also being directly adjacent to the towns of Canmore and Banff during the height of the tourist season also made it challenging. Smoke was a large management issue that required lots of communication with stakeholder notifications, meetings, and public notices. There is an important ecological need to maintain and restore this habitat as outlined in the Banff Park Management Plan. It is important grizzly bear and wolf habitat. As Charlie McClellan's master's research showed, one female grizzly bear's entire home range was the burned area on the fair home. Additionally, there was evidence that the fair home wolf pack would also stay on the burn side of the highway rather than go elsewhere. The Fairholme Bench is also important elk habitat and a transportation corridor in the fall as elk move back into the park for the winter. Due to the location and other lessons learned from 2003, the reburn will be conducted in the fall to limit the potential for smoke issues and holdover problems that happened throughout the summer of 2003. Consultation with stakeholders, surrounding municipalities, and input from Indigenous nations are some of the important steps we are taking within our communications plan. Some of the additional tools and tactics used in the communications plan will be public notices, prescribed burn status updates, smoke-sensitive notifications, a detailed highway traffic strategy and rail strategy, in-person visitor information, and in-person prescribed fire information using our fire communications trailer, which also helps to ensure public education and safety. As you can see, the lodgepole pine region within the Fairholme is quite dense and is growing up quite quickly, making it difficult for wildlife to move and utilize this montane ecosystem. We'd like to thank you for joining this virtual field trip of the landscape level fire restoration projects we have completed in Banff National Park.
Just quickly going over our communications and stakeholder engagement. Public perception support is paramount because without public and stakeholder support, we really wouldn't be able to pull off any of the prescribed burns that we do. We also have 4 million visitors per year, so education and outreach and public safety is extremely important. And there's also the need to consider smoke mitigations for major transportation corridors, such as the Transport Canada Highway and the Canadian Pacific Railway that I mentioned in the video. These smoke concerns are unlikely to go away in the coming years, so it's really important that we maintain our public trust and understanding around the benefits of prescribed burns.
One area that we are, as the federal government in Canada, trying to get more involved in is in the engagement of Indigenous nations that had their traditional territories within our national parks. In Banff, as we mentioned at the very beginning, Banff is situated in the traditional territories of the Treaty 6, 7, and 8 nations, as well as the Métis homeland. And Indigenous cultural burning is really going to be key to fire restoration and landscape resilience as we head into the future. I wanted to make the point that Indigenous cultural burning is different than the prescribed fire that we as Parks Canada do. It's done for a range of a variety of reasons. And you know, a lot of the work that we do within Parks Canada is to kind of reverse some of the negative impacts of fire exclusion on the landscape at a large scale level. But there are many different reasons that Indigenous nations would have burned in historically. And the photo you see there on the right is of a Blackfoot man lighting grassland fire in the 1900s. It's a photo from the provincial archives. And, you know, we are engaging with and consulting directly with Indigenous nations as to how they want to interface with the fire management within the national parks. There are a number of parks within the mountains that are working directly with nations in terms of capacity building. And we're trying to, you know, facilitate the reconnection with the land to the cultural burning practices. One of the projects that we're working on in Banff is working with the Métis Nation of Alberta on a Métis youth camp and workshop on cultural burning to invite families and youth to one of our historic sites to talk about fire ecology, but also about their own nation's cultural burning practices. And the one real point I wanted to make also is that this is about, you know, capacity building within nations, as well as knowledge sharing between us and the nations, and not that we want to appropriate the cultural burning and do it ourselves, but to work together to facilitate it happening within our national parks. And there are a number of programs we can look to all over the world that are way ahead of us in this regard, but we are actively working towards this goal in Banff as well. Next slide. So just in conclusion, as with many places in North America, we've had the alteration of our historic fire regime. You know, key to that is the removal of Indigenous burning. The fact that fire suppression has led to fuel buildups and decreased biodiversity, and that we are trying to restore fire through prescribed fire and manage wildfire to increase resilience to wildfire and climate change. And we're working with Indigenous nations to reintroduce cultural burning practices that are key to fire management in the park. And so we have time for questions if anybody's got any.
All right, well, thank you so much for that tour. Thank you for sharing the place that you get to work with us. And thank you all for joining us. My name is David Godwin, and I am the director of the Southern Fire Exchange with the University of Florida in the southeastern US. And we have about 7 minutes remaining in this session for this virtual field trip, and then we'll be moving to another one. So if you have questions for Jane or for Tommy about where they work, about the things that they've been working on with prescribed fire in the Banff region, please go ahead and put those in the chat window, and we will try and get to as many as we can in the time that we have remaining. Thank you for those videos. That was a fantastic and just a really cinematic tour of the places that you all get to work. It's coming from a different region that just is stunning and beautiful. While we wait to see if we have any questions, I was curious. It looked like you had a graph, a chart that you showed at the beginning of your presentation depicting wildfires and prescribed fires in the region over time. And so I was curious, have you seen impacts from your prescribed fire program on the wildfires in the region?
Well, our fire regime here is really strongly kind of biased towards the anthropogenic part of the fire regime. We haven't had a ton of larger wildfires. However, we have had a number of large wildfires in adjoining parks in Kootenay National Park, as well as in Jasper and in northern Banff. And there definitely have been some, you know, positive benefits to in some of the areas where they've burned into areas where we've burned before or adjacent to. But what we're also seeing, as many places are, with the current types of drought conditions that we're seeing, that even places that have burned fairly recently are burning just as well as places that hadn't burned. So I think the key there is the maintenance of of these areas and kind of getting it back to that kind of lower intensity, lower severity fire regime.
So you talked a little bit about engaging with the public and some of the nearby communities, and how some of these prescribed fires were for fuel reduction purposes to protect some of the nearby towns. What kind of feedback have you had from the public about about your programs?
Yeah, we've been pretty fortunate to have had quite a bit of social science done in the national park, and so we've definitely seen a shift, you know, from the 80s and 90s when prescribed fire was definitely not supported. Some of the social science kind of showed that both residents and employees of Parks Canada weren't necessarily supportive of the program. But as we increase the amount of education and outreach to kind of improve the public's understanding of why we're doing this and how this is kind of proactive management, we get quite a bit of strong support. That opening slide that we had with the really big smoke column, you know, even though that was about 20 kilometers in the backcountry, you could see that smoke plume very clearly from the town of Canmore. And Canmore is about, I don't know, I think it's 10 or 15,000 people, with many, many visitors from Calgary. And despite being able to see the column quite well, because we had communicated what we were doing, most of the feedback on social media was really positive, giving us kudos for doing that. Even though at the same time there was a wildfire burning right adjacent to the park that was actually creating quite a bit of fear for people. It was interesting to see the comments about our prescribed fire and that they were generally positive.
That's really encouraging. So I'm curious to hear what are you able to burn as much as you would like to burn as a program within your region? And if not, what are some of the challenges that that are holding your program back from what you'd like to achieve?
Yeah, well, our target locally here is 1,400 hectares per year. That only represents 50% of the historic fire cycle. And, you know, in some years we can achieve that. I think it is getting more and more challenging, not necessarily because we don't have the weather windows, which is what a lot of people think, but, you know, we're a fairly small program. And, you know, in Canada, as you've seen in the last few years, we've had very large fire seasons. And a number of years, our larger landscape fires have been kind of put on hold in terms of all of us having to respond to the wildfire situations in adjacent agencies or within our own agency. And so it really puts a strain on the resources that we have available, and the comfort level of managers and the public for us to do prescribed fire when there are large kind of interface wildfires going on elsewhere. So that's definitely a challenge, and obviously weather's always a challenge, but I think that you know, largely like the public and the management support is there. It's just difficult with, especially with climate change, with the fire seasons going the way they are. It's just harder and harder to do our stuff at the same time as responding to wildfires.
All right, well, unless there are any other questions that come in right now on the chat, I think we're going to wrap up and move on to our next field trip. So if we were all together in the field or in the room, I would say let's give you all one big round of applause and say thank you so much for sharing the place that you get to work and the kinds of things that you guys have been doing in that region. Beautiful videos and great work, and we hope that if we can all visit, I'm sure, in person someday. And until next time, I hope you'll be able to bring another virtual field trip to one of our next conferences. So thank you again so much. And we are going to shift gears, and I see Vita, you are here. Vita Wright is the PI with the Northern Rockies Fire Science Network, and she is going to share a presentation and a virtual field trip that their Fire Science Exchange has been working on. Right, let's see, Annie, can we move over and let Vita share her screen?
Can you hear me, David?
Yes, I can.
I started talking before I unmuted, so sorry about that. And what I was saying is that I wanted to thank you guys for that information and presentation, and just it's a hard act to follow, but we live in the same beautiful part of the world here in the Rocky Mountains, and would like to share some of that with you today. So I'd like to start by sharing that we in the Northern Rockies Fire Science Network work in the ancestral territories of tribal nations in the Rocky Mountains of Montana, Idaho, Washington, and Wyoming. And there are a lot of reservation lands in the region, but we recognize fully that the importance of lands far beyond reservation boundaries for cultural practices and ceremonies. And tribal communities in the region have used fire since time immemorial. So we strive here to promote communication and collaboration and shared learning in the larger wildland fire community to support land managers in co-managing these ecosystems for generations to come across all the lands in the region. We urge you, people who are interested in the region, to take time to learn about the history and the treaties and the culture of tribes within the area where you live, work, or visit. The U.S. Northern Rockies has been an important part of the evolution of wildland fire management, especially for the United States Forest Service. Fires in the region have had national implications for federal interagency and federal interagency wildland fire policy and management across all the lands. I'll be showing 2 videos today, actually. In the future, we look forward to sharing more videos that we're developing on cultural burning and on integrating traditional knowledge and fire management. But today there won't be a lot of time for reflections and dialogue. I hope you enjoy these videos, and go ahead and share your thoughts in the chat to make sure that we get time to share that. And before starting, just want to thank all the video presenters, the consultants and reviewers, and the videographers. So with all those words said, which probably took more time than I wanted it to, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and start the first video. Let's see.
All right, that sounds like it's working, Vita. We can hear it.
We had lodgepole pine at less than 8% fuel moisture. Gives you a precursor of kind of what to expect as it came forward. And then the summer kind of started. It was beyond anything that anybody knew how to model, knew how to calculate. It was basically the opening of a new generation of how we were going to look at fire management. Superintendent Barbie, he had the right idea. He had the education, he had the experience around fire, he felt comfortable with it, and he knew it, and he belonged in that ecosystem. And that was the fundamental principle that everybody operated on. It belonged there. And the challenge was the American public and the administration wasn't comfortable for the fallout and the size that it was going to create. And when you put smoke in Kansas City from Yellowstone, it gets attention.
The woods are so dry that it's drier than kiln-dried lumber. Now, when I went out there, I had exactly the same reaction you did. You mean we're going to burn up Yellowstone National Park because it's our policy not to fight fires?
Barbie was under terrible pressure. I think he did well. You will hear within some of the community that, oh, they didn't have a good plan and they didn't do this, but they did it. And that takes guts. And he stood up and did it. I admire him for it. The most powerful force on our landscape is fire. It releases more energy and cycles more material than anything we do. So you've got to be willing to do it. Now, I'll tell anybody today, if on the night before you have to make a decision on a prescribed fire, I want you to wake up in the middle of the night and I want you to ask yourself a question. Am I going to make that decision for the good of the landscape or for the good of my career? Don't tell me what you're going to say. Tell yourself. Ask yourself the question. Am I going to make the decision for the good of this landscape that I'm managing or for the safety of my career? And then I want you to ask yourself another question. If you said you're going to do it for your career, let me ask you one more question. Should you have your job?
Well, fire is a part of all of these ecosystems, you know. The Yellowstone fires of 1988 were something that really brought fire into the living rooms of most Americans. But it wasn't an ecological disaster of any sort. The Yellowstone ecosystem has burned many times. The species there are easily capable of enduring these kinds of fires. When fires occur and kills the parent tree, the seeds are released into fresh mineral soil and you end up with opportunity for regeneration.
What we had there prior to 88 won't be there afterwards. So it's gone, it's destroyed. But that doesn't tell it in terms of an ecological perspective. Yes, the trees as we know them have changed. Literally before the end of the fire season, in fact, midway through the fire season, you could go to the early burns and they were already sprouting green and regrowing. And so that changed people's perspective. It's not gone, it's not devastated, it will come back.
None of it would be there without a fully functioning ecosystem, and fire is part of that. If you realize that, why would you want to get rid of fire? If we're going to manage those for sustainability, then we need to have those kinds of fire influences there. Without it, those species wouldn't survive.
Probably one of the most significant things that the Forest Service has ever done in the effects of managing a landscape is to create the 10 a.m. policy. The 10 a.m. policy said all fires are bad. They will be put out by 10 o'clock the next morning because that's the start of your burning period. That's when the fires start to run. So what did that do? That's the fires in 1940. There's the only fire that got away from them. That's 1940. Look at 30. Look at 20. Well, what do you know? There's 50. Little fire right there. There's the 60s. One of them got away from them. There's a few little ones. 1970s, no fires except that little bitty one. We're putting them all out. It's graphic. 1980s, same thing. How many years of fire suppression do we have? How much has the trees grown in that period of time? 1940 to, that's 40 years, 50 years at the end of 80s. Still didn't do much. Now you're beginning to see this is in the Selway Bitterroot. seeing the effects of our fire program that started in 1973, 72. And so they're getting a little fire, they're changing their attitudes. By 2000, we've changed our attitude enough that we're using resource fires in various places, which we did not do before, because the 10 a.m. policy is gone. Now you're doing fire management. Big difference, big change. Kept working on this plan, and we ended up taking it to Washington, D.C. Bob Much and I did. And this is the briefing book that we took to the chief. It's called Ecological Interpretations of the White Cap Drainage, a Basis for Wilderness Fire Management. The chief at the time was John McGuire. And the director of research, and I think his name was Buckman, but he was in the room. And we showed it, and by the way, I would share with you that by this time I was well aware of what the Park Service was doing. And they were starting their fires in the Sequoia country, Kings Canyon and so forth. And I knew some of those people, and I knew that they were applying fire to the landscape. They'd been doing so for about 2 or 3 years. So one of the ways we convinced the chief's office is that we needed to catch up with the Park Service, because we didn't want them to be ahead of us. So we were trying to market this and sell it. And Buckman said, I think we should do this because we want to protect those old yellow-bellied ponderosa pine, and the only way to do it is through fire. Well, that's true. However, McGuire understood, and he turned to him and he said, Buck, I think that was the name. He said, Buck, this isn't about protecting the yellow-bellied pine. This is about putting the ecosystem back into sync. This is about using wilderness as an untrammeled natural phenomenon so that we can learn from it. Bingo, the guy got it. And that was the first articulation that I ever heard inside the Forest Service of the proper role of fire in wilderness, was to have the natural system function naturally.
West Fork, this is Bad Luck Lookout, over.
And then we had the fire, I think we called it the Bad Luck Fire.
I have a fire to report at 179 degrees, 10 minutes. It is just a half mile below my lookout.
That was a defining moment too. Now, I'd had fire as a responsibility when I was a staff man. And so I'd done a fair amount of suppression. So I go out to see the fire. I actually took my kids out. It was on a Sunday. We went out to the fire, and I was carrying a fire shovel. And we were walking up the hill. And I had to fight myself to keep from using the shovel to turn a log around so it wouldn't roll down the hill, or to dig a little spot so that the pine cone, because it was so natural that if you went to a fire, your reason to go there was to put it out. It was in me too. And by the middle of the afternoon though, and I was able to watch it roll down the hill and burn and come back up. The pine cones would roll down, you'd hit a bit of fuel, come back up the hill. Wow, this is not a fire I've ever seen. Because I always went into a fire with the concept of where's its weak point, how can I put it out? And now I'm watching it as a process. That was a defining afternoon. Just to go out there and be an observer of fire, not a suppressor. By that time in the Forest Service, I don't think there were really very many observers of fire. Everybody that was in the fire game was a specialist in suppression. And suddenly we're changing. This was not let burn, that's what everybody called it. It was a prescribed fire program, carefully structured, approved by the Chief of the Forest Service, and it worked. When we went in, you could see it didn't destroy the landscape. You could see how it enhanced the natural.
As you get more and more fires on the landscape, you end up with kind of a self-limiting situation. You increase your comfort zone in managing future fires because you really are creating a mosaic of different time since burn patches, okay, a puzzle piece pattern out there, so that then when new fires start, there's some confidence that you have moderated the fire growth potential on these fires. And so it's easier to make decisions on these landscapes.
Canyon Creek started in June, and the ranger approved it. And by being out there, you could stand on a ridge top and you could see the fire burn patterns. You could see the mosaic on the ground. And it looked like it was multiple years of fires. And so we were of assumption that you would get some pretty good fire back there, but they basically wouldn't go very far. So I'm feeling pretty confident. We're telling everybody we got it under control. It's going to be fine. And let's see, it was in August or late July, the first big run came, and that was 10,000 acres. And I was here in town. I was driving down the street over here someplace, and I saw a cumulus cloud up over there on the horizon. And I looked around, and there weren't any other cumulus clouds anywhere. And I said, oh boy, we finally got it to burn. And it burned 10,000 acres, and it burned it in a manner that it was a good mosaic. Burn a little, not burn a little, burn, 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 burn. And we flew it. It looked great. Well, it's best to make a long story short, I guess. It piddled around and kept doing those little burns all summer long. And we were expecting the weather change that usually occurs about the 20th of August in Missoula, Montana. It always rains fair week. Everybody said that. It didn't happen, and the fire just kept burning. And we weren't calling a suppression fire. We were trying to allow it to be a wilderness fire. And we began to get nervous. And then it started, by that time, it started giving us trouble. Yellowstone's burning, we have no resources. We don't have helicopters, we don't have fire crews, we don't have anything. They're all down in Yellowstone on the 88 fire. And so, even if I wanted to put it out, I couldn't put it out. Even if we called it a suppression fire, we couldn't put it out. So we're living with it. And by that time, we're up around 60,000, 70,000 acres, and it's pretty scary. There's fire all over. The fastest spread in coniferous forests that had ever been recorded on the North American continent. Well, 88 fire really taught us a lesson of humility, because we didn't ever think we'd have this fire. We really didn't. And so we had reassured the public all year long, all summer long, that they were safe. And they weren't. We needed to be more humble about how we dealt with the public. It was an unpredictable event that, from my standpoint, did not change the commitment to fire management. By that time, and I had checked it out, we'd had 350 fires in the wilderness under prescription by '88. None of them had caused a problem. We had a wilderness fire in '79, I put it out. Was that a mistake? Would we have been better off if we'd allowed it to burn 30,000 acres? If it had burned 30,000 acres, the fire of '88 would probably have not gone out of the wilderness on the south end. So I tell fire managers, putting one out can be a mistake too.
In 1994, the howling fire started on June 23rd, which in the northern Rockies is a fairly wet time. In fact, it started during a rainstorm. We sent some people in, and sure enough, they found a little fire that had started. Very small. They could have stomped it out with their boots at the time and be done in 5 minutes. And we said, no, that's in an area where we can allow fire to burn, and let's step back. It's raining right now. It probably won't continue through the night, and we'll do some analysis and we'll see where we're at. And sure enough, the fire continued to burn. And we sent people in to do some monitoring. We had to tell them, hey, be careful where you're walking because you're going to build a fire line around this fire. It really was not much bigger than a campfire. (1994) had become a significant fire season. In fact, we had been getting a lot of questions of whether or not we really should continue managing the howling fire. And we were adamant that we needed to continue managing this fire as a prescribed natural fire. Everything showed that the howling fire was in a place where the likelihood of it moving to where we didn't want, which was southeast towards Apgar and West Glacier, that was extremely unlikely. Well, we got 2 other lightning starts in that MMA, so we had to decide what to do with those 2 fires because by policy they had to be declared suppression fires. And what we decided we were going to do is to contain those within the MMA of the howling fire. Brought up some interesting policy questions because one of the suppression fires burned together with the PNF. So, okay, now what do we have? And some people encouraged us to say, oh, well, now it's all suppression fire. So now you have to go put the howling fire out. And Tom Zimmerman, he was just terrific at looking at things and being able to work with policy. And he said, no, I don't think we need to do that. And so we started to draw a line of what constituted the other fires that needed to be in a suppression mode and versus the howling fire. So it became a very significant fire for several reasons. The howling fire was significant for the park because it was the first fire of any real significance that they had managed as a PNF. Managed it while managing other fires that were much more active. And so being able to build some confidence with fire management in the park. As people started seeing the success and the need for this, fairly quickly, the Forest Service said, hey, this is a really good thing. We are going to have our people participate in the incident management teams. and we are going to have our own fire use modules.
But the rest of the success was the howling fire was allowed to burn till it snowed on it. And then the sequence to that was now we had to look at policies. You saw a lot of people coming into the organization who'd come up being well educated in academia, master's degree in ecology, master's degree in botany, wildlife biologists, all of a sudden playing a role in the leadership of organizations, both in the Forest Service, National Park Service. It shifted how the thinking came about regarding fire management at that time. With National Fire Plan, we had a whole infusion of people, and their whole scope was put fire out. And now we're almost a generation in the fire management organization later, is we didn't put an infusion into the ecology side of the program or the resource management side of the program to basically offset where fire needed to be. What we did was it was all about putting fire out. We staffed engines, we staffed aviation resources. There wasn't the focus on putting fire on the landscape.
The use of fire across the landscape. In a way, it is a belief system that is strongly motivated, very strongly motivated. You know what's good for the land, and you know this societal and the political and the agency back pressure against what you know is good for the land. And so maybe one of the reasons I could do it at that time is I was young enough not to know what to be afraid of. One of the things you learn is if you want to change the paradigm of an agency. Now that's what this was. This wasn't just something that, just tap. It was changing the paradigm, totally changing it. A small group of dedicated people that do not give up and work together, and particularly if you can go across agency lines, that's how change happens. That's how Wilderness Fire Program was able to continue on.
A lot of professional land managers in many disciplines, every discipline, but had fire experience and had knowledge and had qualifications, so that when you had a need to get out and get a prescribed burn done, you could draw people in and you could fill in the number of people you needed. Well, we don't have that anymore.
We don't know what the climate's going to do. We're going through a time period of vast extremes, from very dry to very wet, and we don't know what that's all going to be. We're seeing more fire. That was the hindsight from '88, is you got to think a lot bigger and you got to think longer duration. Fire is a little bit more challenging to manage. We have a lot of managers that may have not come up with the same focus on how fire plays its role in this ecological condition, and that challenges us. But those areas where it's easy to manage for land management objectives, where fire can play its role, those areas have been burned over the last, we're going on almost 30 years now. They have tremendous mosaics in them. And so those fires aren't getting as big anymore, and they're being managed by natural boundaries.
The agency has got to recognize that healthy, functioning ecosystems is our protection against climate change. And the way we do that in most of the Western states is through a good fire use program. We can keep these ecosystems healthy if we do it right.
For tens of thousands of years, people never deluded themselves that they could control fire. So they didn't try. They tried to work with it. Indigenous uses of fire was everywhere. That they were burning, and they were very expert at it. Not only have we come in and been suppressing fires for more than a century, but we've also removed the addition of fires from the indigenous people. What we're doing is we're actually making these ecosystems more sensitive to climate change. We're making the worst fires worse. We're saving all the biomass that accumulates that normally would be depleted through repeating burns. We are saving that biomass for the worst case, where we already know we're going to lose. So, the conclusion from all of the research and my personal experience is that fire is an ally. It's the only way out of the situation. I mean, literally, fire is the solution. It's the problem, but it's also the solution. It's the only solution.
The air in town felt heavy. It weighed on our chests. Our hands dirty no matter what we did. So when morning came, we left town behind. La da 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 dum. to the mountain. We left our footprints in the mud. They followed us no matter where we went.
All right, Vita, are you still here?
I'm here. I'm stopping my share. And I know we're limited, but I'm going to go ahead and move straight into the next video because whereas this one was really telling the story, the next video is aimed at managers. And so I think that people here will be interested in hearing the points of discussion and lessons learned by many more speakers from our community of fire experts. So I'm just going to go ahead and move right into that, David.
All right, that sounds great, Vita. We'll look forward to it. I'll give you an audible once it starts rolling to let you know it's going.
Okay, so I stopped my share, so I'm going to open up the next one and then start my share.
Fire is inevitable. It's going to happen. And nothing we can do about it. You know, what we can do is control when, to some extent, what effect
They have, but not if we have a fire or not.
Fire doesn't benefit everything, certainly, but in a large landscape, without having periodic fires in most of our ecosystems, we lose what is wild and natural.
So you got to make
Can
choices.
you back it up and start it
what
from the
are you
beginning?
wanting? Because nature doesn't stop. It keeps moving forward in this process.
Okay, we're fire management professionals. We shouldn't be reacting as this is an emergency event all the time. We should be looking at this as how do we manage the event and be.
Fire is inevitable. It's going to happen, and there's nothing we can do about it. You know, what we can do is control when, to some extent, and what effects they have, but not if we have a fire or not.
Fire doesn't benefit everything, certainly, but in a large landscape, without having periodic fires in most of our ecosystems, we lose what is wild and natural.
So you got to make choices about what are you wanting. Because nature doesn't stop. It keeps moving forward in this process.
Okay, we're fire management professionals. We shouldn't be reacting as this is an emergency event all the time. We should be looking at this as how do we manage the event and be more thoughtful and mindful about our outcomes.
So what kind of fire do we want? Well, if you know that you have risk either way, if you try to kill the fire, okay, you don't have risk today, but you're just delaying that risk till tomorrow, some time into the future, and you're probably making it worse.
The reality is, every time we put a fire out, we are deferring risk. That landscape will burn sooner or later. We can have it burn under less extreme conditions or more extreme conditions. But really, all you're doing is deferring that risk.
It would be far better for us to manage fires where we have the ability to have them running into one another and becoming self-limiting than if we don't do anything and just wait for the big catastrophic fire 20 years from now.
Fire does appear to be self-limiting on the landscape. So that means that when fires occur on the landscape and subsequent fires occur, they bump into those fires. Those earlier fires have a moderating effect on subsequent fires.
Be prepared, you're not going to make everyone happy with every decision. So regardless of which way you make that, be prepared to have your rationale and think through it and be able to articulate it. And you can't just say, oh, that was a gut feeling, that was a good call that way. You got to know why you're making that decision.
When you're making a decision about a wilderness fire, you do have to understand that things can go bad. And, you have to be ready to accept what happens when they do. And that's the That's the part of being a line officer. I think it's real difficult.
If you choose to manage a fire and there's an unwanted outcome, it's easy to criticize that decision, but it's always, nobody's going to criticize you for taking an aggressive initial attack action that was unsuccessful. That said, I think that as land managers and as stewards of the land, we need to be making informed, good decisions of what's best for the landscape, and not just always going to that easy button.
Everybody's got to have a first experience. The first time you do anything, there's going to be a certain amount of uncertainty that goes away with time. And so anytime you have a line officer or a new fire management officer, they're going to look at it differently and probably with a little more aversion to taking a risk.
We've had a lot of these fires in recent years where these line officers were new and taking those fires on. And, and we did things like, let us write the briefings for you and let us coach you through this. You should not be afraid to understand your limitations. I wouldn't view that as a weakness to ask for help. And I don't think your staff would either, because, they want to be valued also.
You need to put some trust and faith in your people. You need, even though you're new and even though you're inexperienced in this, you need to bring together your team and have them help you make that decision, but you should not overrule them out of fear.
We have really good modeling now. We can give you some pretty good idea how far it is, and are you comfortable with it? And if you're not comfortable with where it's going to get, or you're concerned with what it's going to burn up, do you take on the fire, or do you take on protection of what you're going to do? And that was the big shift. Is we had now the opportunity is go put the money and the effort into protecting that point that you're worried about losing, and let the fire do what it's supposed to do. And if you can't do it or you're not comfortable with it, the first and foremost thing is ask for help. There's still people out there that know how to do it.
From 1990 through 2050, Wildfire Today reported that there were 452 fatalities in wildfires. Those were all suppression events. Not one of them has occurred on a wildland fire managed for benefit. Whether you go back to PNFs or wildland fire use, that says a lot about what we're doing when it comes to those strategies.
When we engaged that fire, we were there probably 10 minutes, and the lookout that we had nearly got taken out by a snake. So that kind of put everything into context as what exactly are we doing? If we put this one out, it's going to burn during the next one.
There'd been, 35, 40 years that we could put in a fire line and it would stop a fire. That wasn't happening anymore. And so now we had to think differently about what we were going to do. And the successes were protect what you cared about, whether it be administrative sites, whether it be visitor facilities, and basically be safe.
And people always go, well, it's still burning, it's in the park. Can you do something about it? Well, we could do a little bit about it, but the wiser thing to do is to just herd it until it naturally stops. The weather changes it or it hits a natural barrier.
But you have the control to implement management actions to what we always call delay, direct, or check the spread of fire. If you want to delay the spread of fire, you may drop some water or do some scratch lines or something to slow it down. If you want to direct the fire, you may put a line in or point the fire, turn the fire so it moves in one direction versus another.
You definitely need patience and let it kind of come to you, but you still need to be proactive and be ahead of that curve to where if it decides to come out somewhere where you do need to manage a certain site, you need to be ready for it.
Associated with all these fires, there's a great deal of uncertainty. And decision support is about removing as much of the uncertainty as you can. And I think you want to be labeled as someone who who analyzes the situation, weighs the information, factors in the decision support information, understands what might, attempts to understand what might happen and see if there's a way to mitigate that.
I don't think agency administrators should get comfortable in managing decisions on fires that you're wanting resource benefit objectives to be achieved. And that's because if you get comfortable, you may start missing things that you need to pay attention to. And it's not that you should be fretting and losing sleep every night about it, but you should be very diligent and looking at all of the potentialities that could occur in a very methodical way.
So our team is set up to look at long duration fires and to be able to look out into the future and with the planning and analysis tools available to be able to model probable fire growth and fire behavior and fire weather, and to be able to put together plans that did more than just day-to-day operations for suppression.
The long-term analysts are looking at weather and fuels, fire history, and things like that to try and predict what the fire is going to do. The strategic operational planner is going to be more focused on taking the information from the long-term analysts, what they think the fire is going to do, where it might want to go, and designing a long-term response to that potential fire. They're going to be developing basically lines on a map or points on a map that are incorporated through what's called management action points, or MAPs, actually placed on the map, and they are, for lack of a better term, serve as triggers or starting points for taking some sort of a management action.
And if you take the time to do the analysis, support decision making, do the assessment, you can have a good plan. And if you can't, that leads you to a decision, well, this is not a good decision to make.
If you have a plan, and it's a good plan, and you follow that plan, the outcome, even though it's unknown to us at the start of the plan, if you do those three key things, you can do no better than that.
The first thing that's going to make success is have your public constituency and your surrounding partners with you, and that they know that you're going to be doing this and what your expectations are.
Because ultimately, your ability to be effective and have a backcountry program for fire management rests with people's support for that. So there's a lot of, bridge building and restoring people's confidence in our ability to make good decisions about fire.
We had a congressman came through, and we briefed him for almost an hour on our management plan, all the long-term risk assessment we did, all the actions we took, and his response was that he had no idea that we went into that detail of planning because he thought we were just letting the fire burn. And as we went through that, he said, wow, I've got a new understanding of things, which shows that if you can get people to listen, that we don't just turn our backs on these fires, but we are actively engaged in management.
What we're asking people to do and accept is a much more complex topic. And for that, you need to be able to ask questions, you need to be able to clarify misperceptions, and that goes both ways. Interactive communication allows that knowledge building. It also helps people build trust.
Our public can't possibly accept all of the nuance if they don't know the potential of this program and the long-term benefits based on the short-term inconvenience to their lifestyle.
On the night before you have to make a decision on a prescribed fire, I want you to wake up in the middle of the night and I want you to ask yourself a question. Am I going to make that decision for the good of the landscape or for the good of my career?
You're going to win a few, you're going to lose a few, and it's okay to lose, but you got to learn from them.
Boy, if you want to sleep well every night, then the suppression decision's the easier one. But if you really want to feel good about what you're doing and how you're managing the wilderness, then you can get a lot of benefit out of those hard decisions.
All right, Vita, can you hear?
Here, I know
All
there's
right.
a lot to unpack between those two videos, but I hope people enjoyed them.
Oh my gosh, that was amazing. Thank you so much for allowing the virtual field trip. I see some folks already putting clapping hands in Zoom. If we were all in a room together, I'm sure we would all just be clapping and excited and thankful that you guys opted to share these through AFE and through the virtual field trips. So just a point of order here. We are at 2:38 p.m. Eastern time. Our next sessions will get things started at 3 o'clock. So we have about 20 minutes until the plenaries get going. Officially, the field trips are going to be wrapping up in about 2 minutes, but Vita and I have talked, and I'm certainly willing to stay here and run up until we get to the plenary session. So if y'all want to have a conversation with Vita about these videos and give her some feedback and just kind of unpack all this, we certainly have an amazing opportunity.
And I'll
So
just
if
share, David, that we have a few other people on our team. I'm not sure if they're still on, but there's Andrew Larson, director of the Wilderness Institute at the University of Montana, is part of the Northern Rockies Fire Science Network team, and then Signe Larfallum is our coordinator, and Monique Weinkoop is our fire ecologist and tribal liaison. So all of them are here for that discussion as well. Or I don't know if they're all here. They were at one point.
All right, so we have a pretty small group here of only about 20 folks. So if you have comments or questions for Vita and for the members of her team that are on, if I think at this point, if you want to go ahead and just unmute yourself, we are on a Zoom meeting instead of a webinar. So if you want to unmute and ask a question, provide feedback, I think that's certainly okay at this point. We are at the top of the time for our virtual field trips. So before they go, I want to say thank you so much to Jane and Tommy from Parks Canada for sharing their first field trip. In case y'all need to run, and for helping us to learn more about your prescribed fire program at Parks Canada.
Yeah, and David, if people do want to stay and visit, I know you were mentioning that if we were at the conference, we might just hang out in the room and mill about for the break, which we, can't do as well here, but it doesn't have to be a Q&A. I think anyone that wants to chat about the topics is welcome to.
So Vita, I'll just go ahead and open it up a little bit if you don't mind. Could you tell us a little bit about this project? Could you talk about the background? Who was your intended audience for these videos? They seem like it might be a little bit different among the two videos, and talk about what did you want people to come away with after seeing these?
Yeah, so the motivation behind the project, so the Northern Rockies, and I apologize to Jane and others in Banff, we call it the Northern Rockies, but it's the US Northern Rockies. But in the United States, this region has been really important in terms of developing wilderness fire management, especially within the Forest Service. And so, we're sitting here in the region watching all of these experts retire. You kind of caught that maybe in the first video. And so it was initially just really an attempt to capture their thoughts, their expertise, their recommendations to earlier career professionals who may be interested in managing fire use. And so I put out just a really big effort to go around and interview probably 30 people. Carol Miller helped with some of that, and especially coming up with questions. And so then in this first video, that really was one of the key messages that we hoped to get across, is just who's going to carry the torch. And one of the things that became really evident is that in our region, we have the Bob Marshall Wilderness and the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, where for 20 plus years, managers have been very dedicated to wildland fire use. And so they've developed this mosaic that Orville started talking about. And so as those people retire, if somebody replaces them and doesn't have as much of a a passion and a dedication for that type of management. Some of the research, Sean Parks, I don't know if he's on, but some of the research that's being presented at this conference still tells us that, depending on the weather and the ecosystem, we might only have 20 years before that, all that mosaic gets kind of grown up. And so both videos, the second video was intended to show managers, how to do it, and intended to foster dialogue, for example, at trainings or local unit meetings. And then the earlier video that I showed was really just trying to capture the story.
So I was impressed with the production quality, of these videos alone. Did you all work? Did y'all produce these in-house, or did you work with an outside team to produce these?
So the second shorter visit video was produced by earlier career videographer Perry Sassnet, and she does have a background. Her master's is in hydrology or geology, and you can see she does really beautiful editing work, and she also takes beautiful footage, which you didn't get to see as much of. She hasn't found her longtime career yet, so she is doing a lot of consulting, and she has a website. So if you look at the video, and you can find the spelling of her name at the end in the credits, she did the second shorter video with us. And then the first one, I teamed up with a retired film studies director from the University of Montana and her star graduate student, and they just do really spectacular work. And their specialty is documentary, and in particular, this type of documentary. And they were the ones, I wanted to have more of our voices in the first video, but they were really kind of hard-nosed about 3 storytellers, or 4, I guess we ended up with 4 storytellers, no more. That would,
So in the first video, so I'll back it up a little bit. The second video, it seemed like your audience was clearly managers, right? Fire managers, people who are working in this already. In the first video, was your intended audience the same, or were you looking for a different audience there? And then Monique, I saw you had your hand up. So after Vita answers my question, then we'll go right to you.
Yeah, the first video I was really initially thinking would be for internally and externally with informed stakeholders and informed public who knew something about the topic, or at least about natural resource management. So that's what we were aiming for. I think in the end, based on the videographers that helped put it together, it's kind of a PBS style. And for people that aren't in the U.S. public broadcasting system, public TV style video, we won't be able to show it on public TV because there are stricter standards about the people who are funding it not being involved in putting the story together. And I was intimately involved in putting the story together, and so that just felt really important because there's so much nuance to the topic. But we're sad that we won't be able to do that, because that would be a great audience, I think.
All right, Monique, go ahead. If you're still here, just unmute and go ahead.
Can you hear me? It almost seems like you guys should do a part 3. I'm all just, because I was just thinking, this is awesome. Part 1 was great, though I was wondering, where's all the women? And then I saw part 2, and we saw more women in science, which was great. But it tells that story because that's literally how it was. It would be so cool, though, to delve into more of the culture of that area with the local tribes and everything. So, yeah.
Yeah, and we, in addition to what you just mentioned, one of the parts that was really frustrating to not be able to include more detail on was the whole post-2000. You could see we did that through a lot of text. We tried to capture the highlights. Nate Benson, who was a reviewer for this, said, boy, you could just do a whole other video on the post-2000. And I'm not sure if that'll be me. It might be somebody else, but the content is there. And then Monique So we have the Northern Rockies Fire Science Network has 2 more videos that we are working on to really focus on that cultural piece. One of them is with Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes in Western Montana, focused on integrating traditional knowledge and fire. And then the other one is Monique is actually taking the lead on putting together, which is in the early stages, but film in partnership with the Spokane Tribal Network in Eastern Washington, sorry about that, talking about the importance of cultural burns and the importance of cultural burning to the local tribal communities. And I'm so excited for Monique for that one to come together.
Thanks, Vita. No, I was just thinking, because I grew up in that neck of the woods that everyone was talking about, like, fishing and hanging out there. And so it got me all excited thinking about all the cultural stories and everything about that area and stuff. It's pretty cool, deep history. So great job. It was amazing.
Monique also helped us put together the land acknowledgement that I shared in the beginning, because like you said, there is so much culture to acknowledge, especially on the topic of
Very cool. It's exciting that y'all have more those 2 other projects in the works, and I echo Monique. I was like, let's do part 3. That sounds great. I feel like watching these. It reminded me of the Greatest Good series. I felt like they were powerful both in their the information, but also the way it was delivered. It connected with the film.
We had some really talented people working on these, as you can tell, and those videographers that I mentioned from the University of Montana, their whole thing in terms of developing video was making sure that you have storytellers who are articulate and efficient with their words, although Orville wasn't totally, because he was such a good storyteller, but also charismatic and that bring you in. And so, yeah, I learned a lot. I felt like I was taking my own personal class from this film studies director.
Yeah, absolutely. I spent the past 8 months in a strategic communications class, and like a lot of the kinds of things that we talked about in this class, your films utilize. You really evoking emotions and connecting concepts with feelings that really drive home the points in ways that just raw facts and data really often, for most audiences, fail to connect with them.
I think it's interesting, David, this far along in our careers that, we come from these, not just you and I, but a lot of the people here at AFI, come from these backgrounds in ecology, and then we're trying to do a good job of communication. And the ahas that you're describing are things that people, essentially on the other side of campus who study communication kind of think like, duh, why did it take us so long to figure out, how to be more compelling and tell stories with our science writing and our science syntheses.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's all about the story, and coming from forestry schools and the ecology side of things, like that's something that we need practice in. And as you're right, it's the people that do this communication and storytelling day in and day out are like, duh, what are you doing? We're just like getting to
a
it.
resource, if I may. There's a book that I came
Yeah.
across recently by a woman out of Missoula, Montana named Anne Green, and it's called Writing Science in Plain English. And her whole premise is that science writing doesn't have to be dry. And so it's a small little book, but it has these chapters that really try to tell us how to tell story in our science writing. And so there it is. I can type the title in, I guess.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask, we're getting close. I know some folks may need just a minute before going into the plenary sessions again. So what's next for releasing these? You were saying earlier that this is the world premiere. Woo! So how are planning to get these videos out there and to connect them with your target audiences?
Yeah, so the first one we released last year in the summer, and then this one we didn't want to release prior to our kind of open house showing right now. So thank you for the opportunity. Signe, do you want to chime in more specifically about plans for releasing this?
Yeah, I can. I'm doing double duty here. I have my 9-month-old with me, but so you might hear some background noise. But yeah, I think we'll do some general outreach. We don't really have plans right now to do anything formal, but we might explore something for the winter. We have a webinar coming up in January that's related to wilderness fire and the Selway Bitterroot. And so I think it'd be kind of cool to tie these things together. And then there's also a GTR that just came out on the evolution of wilderness fire in the Northern Rockies. And so we'll try to do some joint outreach with the video and the written product. We were not directly a part of the written product, but they're very related. So it'd be cool to bring those two products forward together. But yeah, we'll just do some Twitter blasts and put it in the newsletter. And, I think what happened with the Benefits of Hard Decisions video, which is the second one last year, is it just got in some good hands and people spread the word, and it's gotten a lot of views and a lot of good feedback. So.
Yeah, and David, I cut, you saw me cut the first video pretty abruptly because I didn't want to, there's a lot of time in credits and I didn't want to spend all the time, but I should have hung on one more minute. There's a whole list of managers from the region that we are acknowledging and that contributed to the development of wilderness fire. And so I anticipate sending that out personally to all of them. And so it'll get in those good hands again, like Signe talked about.
I think that second video would be a great resource. I'm in the Southeast, and these are pretty different fires and pretty different ecosystems, but the kinds of lessons and the kinds of conversations that it might spark would still be relevant to share with managers in other parts of the country. It seems like the kind of video that would be interesting to put into RT 130s, to annual refreshers for fire managers and prescribed burners. This time of year, a lot of our prescribed burners and folks in agencies in our neck of the woods are doing their RT 130s and pack tests and that kind of thing. So this is just the kind of thing that I think would plug in well to those and might spark some interesting conversations in regions outside of the Northern Rockies. So Vita or Signe, do y'all have any other parting things that you want to share with us as we wrap things up?
Just want to thank you so much, David, for this opportunity to share it. We knew that that Association for Fire Ecology was really the perfect place to launch this. And so thanks for the great dialogue this afternoon.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for joining us as participants and going on these virtual field trips. This has been a blast. Thank you, Vita. Thank you, Signe, and thank you for everybody in your team for choosing this venue, these virtual field trips to share at AFE. This and yesterday, these were the first virtual field trips we've ever done at AFE conference, and it's been awesome. It's been a blast, and I hope that we're able to. This will be something that will carry through the conferences when we go back in person, and we can add them to our in-person field trips. And maybe Vita and Jane and Tommy at a future AFE conference will actually get into the field and visit your areas. That would be awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all, everybody. And it's about 3 minutes until we head to the plenary sessions. So thanks again and take care.